Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Megan Opria, managing editor of Texas National Security Review. In this episode, we have the second of a two-part discussion about the national security dimensions of food insecurity with former UT Chancellor and former Commander of Special Operations Command, retired Admiral William McRaven, and Congressman Michael McCall, Chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. Moderating this discussion is Chris Tomlinson of the Houston Chronicle. This event took place at the University of Texas at Austin. It was sponsored by the Clements Center and Strauss Center and was co-sponsored by the LBJ School and the Innovations for Peace and Development. I hope you enjoy their discussion and tune in for more episodes of Horns of a Dilemma.
My takeaway from living in Africa was that it was the business people who build countries more than anything else. If you have I would rate a country on its stability based on whether or not a high school kid wanted to be a politician or a businessman. And if all the entrepreneurial spirit was going to be focused on politics, I knew this was an unstable country. Which is to say...
It doesn't bode very well for the two of us.
It should have been in business. I don't know.
Well, I mean...
Where did military rank in that group?
It's very hard to get into an African army. It's a popular job. But the point is that, a lot of this has to be fixed from within. It's not something that the United States can do. I'd like to hear from both of you about what are the limits of U.S. foreign policy and security policy. When do we, where do we risk pushing too far into what's none of our business, and where do we risk pulling back too much?
If I can tell you, and I don't know the Admiral's view on this, I think when we're viewed as an occupier, just like Alexander the Great, when we went into Vietnam and were viewed as an occupier after the French had been there and the Chinese, it's very, very difficult to win that kind of conflict when we're viewed as an occupier in any of these countries. I mean, so I think the great mistake with Iraq, though, was once we did get in there, we didn't have a residual force, and then we left a total vacuum that Al-Qaeda in Iraq then morphed into ISIS and basically filled the vacuum and then had a governance state of the caliphate. Once we get in, we better be damn sure we're gonna win it, and then not stay to occupy. We can have residual forces like we do all over the world to help provide stability. But I think when we start getting into the occupying business, we don't do so well.
I couldn't agree more. Let me give you a little micro example of, I think, kind of the macro problem. And you'll appreciate this, Chris. When we were in Afghanistan, one of our special forces team went into one of the small villages, and we realized that the closest drinking water was almost an hour walk away from the village. So, being good Americans, we thought, well, hey, we're gonna show them how good we are, and maybe we can build some friendships and win the hearts and minds. So we brought in some engineers so that we could pipe the water from the well that was an hour walk away into the local village. And I remember the SF guys, the Special Forces guys, talking to me about the fact that the village elders weren't initially very keen on us doing this. And we didn't quite understand why, but we were Americans. We understood they needed fresh water. The kids needed fresh water. So we built the pipeline from the well to the, right outside the village. Well, what we found was the reason they didn't want us to build it is because the women in the village would walk for an hour to that well. And that was an hour that they were together in a social setting. They loved to go to the well. They would get to the well. They would socialize at the well. This was an important part of the culture of that village, and we had just destroyed it inadvertently. It took us a long time before we figured that out, and finally somehow the pipes broke, and we never went in and fixed it. But back to your point about the limits of U.S. involvement. I mean, I think this again on the micro, the macro is the same thing. So as we look at how do we get involved in a country, back to my point about the State Department and the people that have lived there and understand the dynamics. You really do have to sit down and understand the culture, the importance of the terrain, the security issues. Of course, in a place like Afghanistan or anywhere else where it is a tribal culture, you can't cross tribal lines. So if you don't understand where those tribal boundaries are, and you think by building a school in one location is going to serve that region, only to find out that you have now disenfranchised the other location. So this is about really understanding the culture in a way that again, most military people can't. So I think as long as you rely on the people, again, the host nation, first and foremost, the State Department people that are there and make that part of their livelihood, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that do this for a living, they're the ones that I think have to shape the plan. Is there a limit to what Americans can do? Absolutely there is. And to the Congressman's point, the last thing you want to do is put boots on the ground to solve a problem in a way that could have been solved locally.
So I'm going to move to the submitted questions. The global, so this one is for Admiral McRaven. I think there's a follow-up for you, Chairman. The Global Food Security Act was passed in 2016 and requires the executive branch to develop a strategy to promote global food security, nutrition, and growth. The Global Food Security Strategy, published in September 2016, did not outline any responsibilities for the Defense Department. In your opinion, should the DoD have explicit responsibilities to support this strategy? If so, what should they be? And if not, what role should DoD hold?
Well, it's a complex problem and maybe a complex answer, but I do not think the DoD should be explicitly laid out in that particular act, because at the end of the day, the Department of Defense is there to do just that. It is about the American military. It is about providing hard power and soft power where it is appropriate to do so. And I'm afraid if we start down that slope, that slippery slope of being, apportioned out and having specific details in a lot of these different acts, then before long, the resources of the military no longer go to their primary focus. Having said that, the Department of Defense absolutely understands we have a humanitarian assistance role. When you take a look at the amphibious force, for example, when we think about the great amphib ships and the Marines that are on them, what a lot of people don't realize is most of those amphibious ships also carry foodstuffs for humanitarian assistance. And so when something goes through the Pacific, immediately the amphibious Navy marshals resources and sends big amphibious ships with helicopters, with V-22 tilt-rotor aircraft, with Marines that deliver humanitarian assistance. That is not by chance. That is rehearsed. That is trained for. I mean, these are the sort of things the military does. So humanitarian assistance is absolutely a mission set within the military. It's just not the primary mission set because, as I said before, we know that the skill sets of flying helicopters, setting up landing fields, delivering food aid, these are skill sets that are part and parcel to being a soldier. So to the person who asked the question, I would say, I think it's appropriate that we are not specifically called out in that particular act. But having said that, we clearly have a role and we understand what that role is.
Yeah, I think Chairman, I was going to say, Chairman McCall, you actually helped get that act passed. So what did Admiral McRaven answer the question properly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm never going to disagree with the Admiral. That wouldn't put me in a good spot. He has a lot of friends that know how to shoot really well. But having said, I think
and deliver humanitarian assistance.
But I got to say, when those
well too, and so and I know many of them, they provide a great service to the nation as well. This, I think the State Department, and it was authorized Foreign Affairs Committee for the State Department. They take the lead. They write the strategy. But I think it does need to be done in coordination with the DoD, and I think that's what the Admiral is referring to. Not that the DoD writes this policy. I think it's truly a State Department lead function, but it should be done in consultation and coordination with the Department of Defense, which is sort of what my Global Fragility Act calls for, is when we look at foreign aid, not just state, it has to be USAID, state, and DoD coordinating together, as well as these NGOs that I think provide so much charitable relief. We got to be careful. Like if you look at Central America, where we got a real mess going on with Venezuela and then Central America, and you got a mass exodus problem. And when you put foreign aid down there, you want to make sure it's going to the right leaders and not going into a corrupt government and then going down a cesspool. And that's always a tricky thing. And you probably saw this in Afghanistan when you're throwing all this money into a country, and you have to make sure that there's some stability in governance and it's going to the right places to be most effective, and not just down a rat hole.
And Chairman, the next question is actually a natural follow-up. The global food strategy emphasizes a whole-of-government approach through interagency coordination. In line with this emphasis on collaboration, what role can the private and nonprofit sectors play in advancing global food security, and how can Congress support those efforts?
Yeah, and I think it's a unity of government effort, but it has to be done, again, with the private sector, both the charitable arm of the private sector and also the investment side of the private sector. I think through overseas investment, again, with OPIC, we can do a lot of good in these countries and benefit everybody. I think the best thing we can do is lift their economies through our investment. And then, again, you take care of the poverty issue. You take care of the governance problem and the chaos and the extremism. So I think they all have to be, it's always the adage, the left hand doesn't know what the right's doing in the federal government. And it's very true. And we throw all this money, but they're not working together as a team when it should be a team effort approach. And I think that's the goal behind my bill, is looking at fragile nations. How can we work as a team to stabilize them so we don't have to deal with these problems down the road in a military fashion?
Thank you. Admiral McRaven, looking at the situation evolving in Venezuela right now, how do you see acute food insecurity contributing to the ongoing conflict, and is something that we need to address as part of our conflict resolution efforts? How do concerns about food insecurity affect the development of a U.S. military strategic response in such a complex situation?
Well, I think Venezuela, it kind of personifies a lot of the problems that we have when you're dealing with a country that is in chaos, and how does the military view it? So, again, Venezuela aside, I don't want to get too specific on a specific country, but as a normal matter of routine, again, we're going to look at humanitarian assistance as a way of positive leverage, if you will, in a host nation. So if we know if there is conflict in a particular country, again, working with the State Department, working with all the various intel agencies, to the Congressman's point, just to give you a sense of how we do this operationally. So video teleconferences are a big deal in the military. So let's say country X is having a problem. The first thing that's going to happen is the combatant commander, whether it is appropriate or not, the military generally takes the lead. So the combatant commander, a 4-star Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine general officer, will host a video teleconference, and it will include the ambassador and their country team. It will include main state. It will generally include somebody in the White House. It will include people within the executive branch, within the intelligence community, so we understand what the situation is on the ground. It'll include the FBI, so we understand what the law enforcement issues are. It will include USAID. So we all get on in a virtual room, and we talk through the problems. That's in a crisis situation. I think to the Congressman's point, what we don't do well is long-term in terms of how are we going to apply our humanitarian aid in a whole-of-government constructive fashion where we have a long-term plan. We do it well on a case-by-case basis in a crisis. I don't think anybody does it better. Where I don't think we do it well is because most of these appointees, they're there for a couple of years and they're gone. Somebody's in there for a couple of years. So you can't build a long-term plan that everybody agrees on for the next 10 years. That's where I think we fall down. Operationally, we do it well. So a country like Venezuela or any other country in crisis, we could handle that pretty well. Long-term, over 10 years, how do we invest in Africa? How do we invest in South America? How do we invest in the Middle East? That we don't do so well.
Well, Congressman, if I can ask you to follow up on that, on the Admiral's remarks, that does seem to be a chronic problem in U.S. foreign assistance. You have a lot of politicians, not you, but others, who might see things on a shorter term cycle. They want to see results quicker. The administration changes at a fairly accelerated rate. I know our Pan-Colombia plan to help them has had great results, but that took 3 administrations to agree to stick to it. And problems, frankly, in Africa are generational. If you've got kids that have been sitting in a refugee camp for 27 years, it may take another 27 years to solve that problem. Can you talk a little bit about how to address that?
No, I think it has to be a long-term strategy that we're willing to implement. I mean, the military is great at executing, but a long-term strategy that we're going to stick by. And that's the problem with foreign policy; can change every 4 years depending on who's in the White House. But I think like you mentioned, Plan Colombia was one of the most successful operations, taking a failed state and turning it into one of the best governance countries in Latin America. Venezuela is a little different. We needed a long-term strategy for that. Central America, we have a Central American security initiative, but we have to stick by those plans. Otherwise, we're going to have more problems down the road. And I think that long-term, look at China. They have a long-term plan. They don't change every 4 years. That one belt, one road, it's happening. And it's 2025. And President Xi is now going to be in there, we know, for his lifetime. And his foreign policy is not going to change. I'm not advocating we change the Constitution in the 4-year presidential terms, but I do think it's important that leaders in the Congress who are there longer than a 4-year administration, keep this in mind, that we need to have that long-term vision, because otherwise we'll fail.
Well, I spent 20 years with the Associated Press, and one of the things that I learned was that 90% of peace agreements fail within 5 years. That's how unstable they are, and that's usually because of a lack of commitment that donors make. And it's not just the U.S., it's global. It's a global problem that everyone's excited about getting the agreement signed, and they're excited about the first 18 months of implementing the agreement, but they tend to fall apart. And I mean, obviously we're seeing that in South Sudan right now as part of a problem.
Chris, can I add on to the
Sure.
discussion on Plan Colombia, because I think this is an important example of how things are done well. Now, again, we put billions with a B, billions of dollars into Colombia, but where we had, what was different with Colombia is the Colombian government showed progress on their own. So we had, to your point, over 3 administrations. But the reason we were able to continue it across the administrations was because the Colombians are the ones that went after the FARC. The Colombians are the ones that tried to clean up their own program. Under President Uribe, I mean, he made some incredibly difficult decisions that I'm not sure a lot of other foreign leaders would have made that got them on the path to success. So if you can show success, then I think the U.S. administrations will continue. The problem is, much like the peace agreements, we put millions of dollars into a plan. The next thing you know, there's a new prime minister, a new president, a new approach in that particular country, and whatever we invested in no longer shows any progress, and we're left kind of holding the bag. Plan Colombia, again, you have to give a whole lot of credit to the Colombians for the success there.
Well, and I think that's also what Congress looks for, right? They want to see that the countries where this money is going, it's producing results, and there's a commitment on the other side.
Going back to what Admiral talked about, Uribe, I mean, I'll never forget when Bush struck this agreement with them, and Congress was going to slap it down. And that's precisely what we shouldn't be. I mean, we need that long-term stability commitment to Colombia. And at the end of the day, the agreement went forward. And to the Admiral's point, I mean, Colombia is providing the buffer now between the FARC, a terrorist organization, and the chaos in Colombia. I can't underestimate or understate to you how bad it is in Venezuela right now. It rivals Syria in terms of refugees. Their economy is tanking, and we need to take a look at our own backyard sometimes as well, because I think what's happening in Colombia, it could be a complete disaster.
Well, and
Did I say Colombia? I meant Venezuela.
yeah, you meant Venezuela. But there are other countries in Central America, and we're receiving migrants from those countries as well. So,
And Colombia's
from
taking in a lot of
insecurity.
those
Right.
refugees.
But I will go back also to the issue of politics that I mentioned in my opening remarks. Some of those Latin American countries don't want our help. It is just their pride is too great to be able to accept help from the United States. And unfortunately, they do so, I think, to their detriment.
Chairman, the next question is for you. How do you see global food insecurity as linked to conflict and violent extremism? How might investment in global health and development help mitigate the risks of extremism?
Well, I mean, so, health, nutrition, stability, poverty, all plays into what conditions do the terrorists, what is ideal for them to operate out of? And so we've seen it time after time. It's Afghanistan, what happened. We saw, in Iraq, we're seeing this happen in Africa. Particularly, I worry about what's happening in Africa. Libya is a failed state. I was in Tunisia, actually with then Mike Pompeo, congressman, and we were in Egypt with the Sinai Peninsula where Camp North is, and the ISIS guys were up there, to Tunisia, which is having a lot of problems as well, to Libya, which is such a failed state that we actually had to have their ambassador in exile. Can you imagine being an ambassador to a country, but you're not in the country? He's an ambassador in exile briefing us on the conditions in Libya between General Haftar on one end and the other general. They can't even get their governance unified. So therefore, what's happening? ISIS is flourishing in Libya, and Tunisians are going into Libya to train. And it bleeds over into the Sahel. And one wonders, as the caliphate has collapsed, what is going to be the next sort of country or lack of country where they will find governance? And then I think the biggest concern from the military standpoint and homeland is when they can govern like ISIS could, then they can conduct external operations into the United States. So when I would meet with the Southcom or CENTCOM, they would always say our biggest concern is what external operations are they capable of delivering into the United States. The good news is the military stopped, as you know, with your special operators, stopped 99% of these special operations or external operations from happening. And that's why you didn't see so many terror attacks in the United States. But we always worry about fragile nations like that implode, because out of that they can rear their ugly head and attack the United States homeland.
As said, some of these are deeply, deeply complicated problems that not one branch or one agency can address from the government, or that maybe we can't address at all. Another similar issue is climate change. Got a question from online. It says, some say that climate change is responsible for the food insecurity issues worldwide, yet many in Congress deny the science of climate change. How do you and fellow members of HVAC, House Foreign Affairs Committee, take climate change into account when deciding the best course of action in the face of global insecurity and related conflicts?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's become a really politically charged issue. But I think one thing is clear on the science, and we can debate what's causing this, if it's a natural or if it's man-made, or how much man-made's contributing. But I got a briefing from a NASA scientist who is not a policymaker, but a NASA scientist on the issue. And he showed me that if things don't change, that it's going to dry up. A lot of these areas that we're discussing will get dried up so much that it would be impossible to produce agriculture. So what is that going to mean? Now this is going to be like 50 to 100 years, but long term, what does that mean? And then what can policymakers do to prevent that? I have no reason to believe a NASA scientist would have a political agenda, at least. But when I looked at what will happen if we don't do anything, it's going to get very arid in some of these in these countries, and then maybe you look at desalination issues and other ways to deal with it. But I think at some point, Congress is going to have to deal with the issue.
Mm-hmm. the Strauss Center did research on the intersection of climate change effects and violent acts or insecurity. Admiral, have you seen any signs of that link changes in the climate to insecurity or to hotspots?
Well, I mean, I'm absolutely a believer in climate change, and there is clearly a man-made component to it. I don't have any doubts about that. I think when you take a look at, though, from an instability standpoint, I mean, climate change, as it is occurring, it's obviously the pace of change is increasing. But over my 37 years in the military, the pace was so slight that when you saw a conflict, you didn't immediately say, this is a result of climate change. What you saw was, again, I go back to Restore Hope in Somalia. I mean, you had famine and you had food shortages, and this happens in conflict areas. It happens in South Sudan. It happens now in Syria. So you don't have to have climate change in order to generate, conflict in areas. Having said that, I know it is something that the U.S. military looks at now when we look at places where conflict can arise. Again, I go back to the water issue. The military has always recognized the value of water. And whether it is the Haditha Dam in Iraq or whether it is certain dams, whether it's the Ethiopian Dam outside Egypt, I mean, we understand that the flow of water and what water can do for a nation can immediately cause a conflict. So I think as we, the military, kind of look into the future, those great folks that do that planning are going to look to areas where it is becoming more arid in the Sahel, where the sea is encroaching on Polynesian islands and the impact of the sea in the South China Sea and those sort of things. The military planners absolutely recognize that this is a problem, and I think are preparing to deal with that in the long run. I know are preparing to deal with that in the long run.
Another online question. We haven't talked about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals yet. Goal number 2 is committed to ending hunger. What do you feel are the U.S. obligations to the international community in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we fulfill these responsibilities?
Well, I think I've mentioned several of the bills we passed in recent, last year or two that try to address that. I think the United Nations absolutely has a purpose and a mission in this, and it should be an international driven purpose, not just the United States of America. I think that's what a lot of people are. They want us to carry all the water, no pun intended from the previous remarks, but I think it's important that the UN comes together to provide that sort of assistance and step up to the plate. We traditionally have borne this on our backs because that's who we are as a people, and that's what we're proud of. But I think it's important that the entire United Nations comes together, and things like we did again with PEPFAR and things like that. I think working with the UN, we have our issues with the United Nations from time to time. We got a problem right now with Russia and China and the sanctions and their violations of those sanctions. And, what is the United Nations going to do about that? What's the United Nations going to do about, the fact that some of the major offenders of human rights are on the Human Rights Security Council and are not all that fair to Israel, in my judgment. But with respect to this issue, the UN absolutely has a vital role to play.
And Admiral, I know the U.S. military has started training other militaries to be able to carry out their own humanitarian operations. We've even seen governments offer to help us, like Mexico.
Yeah, so you mentioned what we refer to as the JSET program, the Joint Combined Exercise for Training. This is where one of the things, particularly U.S. Special Operations, but the conventional forces do it as well, is we go into a country and we train the host nation's Special Operations forces so they can deal with their problems so that we don't have to. Yeah. But part and parcel to that, within the U.S. Special Operations, we have what's referred to as the Civil Affairs branch. And the Civil Affairs folks do, again, engineering. They're also the medics and the veterinarians, and they know how to drill wells, and they have kind of public relations people. They are the kind of soft SOFT power that the hard power of the Special Operations brings. So when we go into another country, what we're hoping to do is, one, professionalize their military. So back to the point that, you can't always choose who your allies are when it's important. Sometimes we go into countries where the host nation is not as professional as the U.S. military. They don't have this sense of moral, legal, and ethical that we do, and you try to impress upon them why this is important, why civilian rule of the government is important, but also how to do things like civil affairs, how to take care of their own people in times of Ebola crisis, water crisis, food crisis. This is all part and parcel to, again, what we do as a special operations force around the globe, 90 different countries. That always surprises people because, you tend to think of the raids and the hostage rescues. But frankly, the bulk of our time is spent overseas training host nation militaries to be more professional, to serve their civilian leadership better and to serve their population better, and to be able to deal with crisis in their own country.
Well, and I have to say, the U.S. forces training foreign militaries has had a spotty history in the last 100 years. But working in 30 African countries, I can tell you that I've seen it's a night and day difference whether or not the JSET team has been there, whether or not they've adopted a U.S. military model for its military. And I'm not saying that just to kiss up to the Admiral. But as a veteran, I'm actually kind of very proud of it because it's something I've seen, and I don't think Americans really appreciate enough.
But frankly, I think the U.S. military, learned a lot from bad activities in the 70s and the 80s, particularly in South America. Mm-hmm. We trained a lot of South American countries, and the next militaries, and the next thing you knew, they overthrew the country. That's not a good thing to have happen. And so this idea that now we go out of our way to reinforce the rule of law and civilian and the importance of civilian leadership, I think, is a key component to everything we do in terms of mill-to-mill engagement.
Well, a lot of it's just teaching the military that its role is to protect the country, not the government. Right. Chairman, we tend to focus on addressing food security through reactive measures, emergency food aid, relief assistance. And that can help in the short term, as we discussed. What would you like to see the government do to proactively address food security, to promote strong agriculture and self-sufficient markets in these developing countries, in these fragile countries?
Well, you're right. Sometimes we wait till a disaster occurs and we come in and help them out, and then we're gone. But I think, to the Admiral's point, soft power, hard power. I mean, we have to remember you can't do one without the other. They really should play hand in glove, and that's why state has a role and military has a role. But I think, again, these longer-term strategies that are regional and to deal with agriculture, like the Global Food Security Act, provides funding, but it shouldn't just be borne on our backs. Again, it should be the world responding to these areas to provide the stability necessary. I think NGOs play a great role, Peace Corps, again, private investment. If we can ramp that up, that would be great to see in Africa, because again, they're doing business with the Chinese because, again, as they told me, we're not there. So we need to be sort of looking at that. And going back to what previously, when we passed the Merida Initiative, which wasn't exactly our military going in, but it was to try to, when we were seeing Mexico collapsing because our neighbor next door, and NAFTA was very important. I think we need to make sure that gets ratified. But Merida enforced some of the rule of law that was lacking, and the drug cartels are taking over Mexico. Not to say it's gotten a whole lot better. It still worries me, the influence of the drug cartels down there and the corruption, and you had about 150 political assassinations, down there. But it's really in our best interest when it comes to Mexico and Latin America. They're right in our backyard to have stability, right there.
Now, I've seen some governments use foreign aid as a way to benefit their economies. Japan, to me, is one of the great examples. In the 90s, is they were one of the largest donors in terms of foreign aid, but almost, a large part of that was brand new Land Cruisers going to the United Nations and to aid agencies. It wasn't actually things that were going to help the African. Also, during the 90s, there were USAID chiefs who bragged about how much 85% of every dollar spent on foreign aid was spent in the U.S. economy. Among your colleagues in Congress, do they understand that when you take excess food and put it in Africa, you kind of blow up the local agricultural economy? Or do they now see foreign aid as a good beyond trying to help U.S. farmers or helping the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think that's, again, the bills we pass is to provide that agriculture assistance, not to, it's better to teach a man how to fish than to give him fish every day. And so that's where it needs to go, and it needs to be, reformed. And again, I'd really see an opportunity in Africa with the private investment. And I think the economic agenda is going to be very important for the State Department to have not just a diplomatic agenda, but an economic agenda to lift up these nations so they are more loyal to us than China.
Mm-hmm. Well, and my colleague Howard French wrote an entire book about how poor Chinese are actually migrating to Africa to stay there, to kind of settle and become part of the fabric of those countries, which is not something I saw a few Americans do that. I considered it briefly, but it's not something I've followed through on. Admiral McRaven, during your time in the U.S. Special Operations Command, for example, your time in Afghanistan, did you encounter any situations where food insecurity directly caused or contributed to an escalation in conflict?
Well, I think that's dovetails off a previous question. What I have seen is, again, food being weaponized. And frankly, Iraq, Afghanistan, every place where there's conflict, food and water become a weapon for the insurgents, for the terrorists. And when you think of candidly why the Taliban have been so successful in some areas is because they also understand how to manage the land. And of course, as you know, in Afghanistan, it is about land rights, and that land right is about kind of food productivity or poppy productivity. But the Taliban could manage the land, could arbitrate the disputes, whereas the local tribal leaders couldn't do that very well. But that was, in a way, weaponizing their policy. So by being the arbitrators of the land issues in the rural areas of Afghanistan, they were the guys that focused the agenda of the locals. And that was a way to, again, move their agenda forward. In terms of, stopping caravans of food and redirecting water. This is always a part of conflict. I don't care whether it's today or, during Alexander's time. That is the way the enemy, and frankly, the Allied forces will always use things to leverage against the enemy and the enemy against the Allies. So you bet, food, water, it is all part of the weapons of war, unfortunately.
I'm going to wrap this up with a question that I ask at the end of every interview. Is there something that I have not asked you that you think is important that I'm missing? Congressman?
Yeah, I look at all the threats, and I look at the foreign adversary nations, basically Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and we have to get this foreign policy right. And these are the new threats to the United States. Radical Islamist still could be. There are threats to airliners today that in a classified realm would terrify you. They're still trying to make bombs to get on airplanes and toxic gases. And there's a lot of stuff that keeps me up at night. And we stopped a lot of bad stuff thanks to this guy. And I want to commend you, sir, for your service and what you did for our country during a very trying time. But I think we got to get it together because these foreign adversary nations are trying to, from a foreign policy standpoint, are starting to fill the vacuum and fill the void in these nations that they want to occupy and turn against the United States. And they're the big four that I mentioned. And how we deal with that's going to be very important. How we deal with NATO is going to be very important. Russia's been very aggressive. Now they have, they're in the Ukraine kinetically on a ground war. They're in their cyber, throwing every cyber weapon they have in there. They want to get the Baltic states back. Putin's not our friend. He's our enemy. He's trying to take back the glory of the old Soviet empire. You got Kim Jong-un, big threat from a nuclear standpoint. And Iran's theocracy is filling that vacuum, unfortunately, that's left in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Gaza. So those threats are all very real. But if I'm looking at who is going to be our major, biggest competitor in the next decade, I would have to say it's China. And they are stealing everything we got, because why invent when you can steal? And we've got to get the cybersecurity down to stop that theft and that aggression and espionage. And as they're trying to go into these countries that are so important for the future, and that is the African continent, we have to realize who our adversary is.
Mm-hmm. Admiral?
Whenever we're having national security discussions, I'm often asked what do I think the number one national security issue is, and the one that kind of keeps me up at night. And I think people think I'll answer North Korea or Iran, but my answer is K through 12 education. And the reason this is so important is because we have got to educate the youth of America, or we won't have to worry about national security in the future. The fact of the matter is, events like this, students coming to the LBJ School and to the Strauss and the Clements Center, higher education we do pretty well, but we're going to have to get the young men and women into higher education to begin with. And we have got to give them the tools so that they understand what the international environment is all about. Because again, if all we're educating them on is reading, writing, and arithmetic, and we don't give them an opportunity to, one, go abroad and experience different cultures, experience different ideas, then when it comes time to deal with problems of China, of Latin America, of the Middle East, they won't have the intellectual tools to understand how to do this. Back to my point about the rank and file of the State Department. I was always amazed. We used to, there was a book out, or there was a thing out one time that said, the Defense Department is from Mars, State is from Venus. That was not meant to be laudatory for the State Department. But I'll tell you what I have found in my time and working with them. They are incredible patriots, incredibly courageous, incredibly dedicated, and incredibly few of them. So, we've got to get young men and women into government service. We've got to get them into the intelligence community, into the law enforcement community, into the State Department where they can make a difference on national security. But that's not going to happen unless we educate the youth of America. So to me, the number one national security issue is the education of the youth of America.
If I could follow up on that, I completely agree. And I think STEM education particularly, you're just seeing a loss of interest in K through 12, getting in science, engineering, mathematics. And so when I look at what's happening in China, they are starting to clean our clocks. They are producing more scientists and engineers in China. And I look at my own 5 kids, and they like a lot of other things. And that's sort of true throughout the nation. And I know we import a lot of scientists and engineers into this country, but we have to start educating more in the United States, homegrown, or this issue of cybersecurity, or the issue of quantum computing. Who will be the first nation to achieve quantum computing? Because as Keith Alexander said, whoever gets it first is going to rule the world. It's like the digital nuclear bomb. Mm-hmm. It is a powerful tool that we better get there first. And we're not going to be able to do it, as if the Admiral says, we're not educating our youth to go into these fields.
Well, I can tell you that every CEO I talk to in Texas has the same view. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Admiral McRaven and Chairman McCall for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. If you liked what you heard today, you can subscribe on iTunes. And don't forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.